Good evening. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Gadi Schwartz coming to you from Moscow, Idaho tonight, where the man accused of brutally murdering 4 college students was arraigned today.
Your Honor, we will be standing silent.
Because Mr. Koberger is standing silent, I'm going to enter not guilty pleas on each charge. Counts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Brian Koberger surprising a lot of people in the courtroom as he opted to stay quiet while the judge entered a default not guilty plea on his behalf. We're going to break down what's next in this case with Danny Savalos. And later, an NBC News exclusive. A source with inside knowledge of the investigation says Koberger may have also been linked to another break-in where he befriended the possible victim. Plus, deal or no deal, new developments over the last hour and those last minutes in negotiations over the country's debt.
Decisions have to start being made. They're 10 days out, so the president has to be serious.
And we are coming to you from Moscow, Idaho tonight, right in front of the courthouse where we saw Brian Koberger, the suspect accused of fatally stabbing 4 Idaho college students, arraigned on all murder charges. And what Koberger said or didn't say during today's arraignment surprised a lot of people inside. Now, last week, we told you about that secret grand jury that indicted him on all 4 counts of murder for the deaths of Maddie Mogen, Zana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and Kaylee Gonzalez. Well, up until now, Koberger had been in custody for more than 5 months without ever entering a plea. And most people in that courtroom today expected to hear him say either guilty or not guilty when he was asked by a judge, but instead he was quiet, his lawyer saying he was choosing to stand silent. At that point, the judge entered not guilty pleas for him and set a trial date, all as our colleagues at Dateline NBC have exclusive new details about the murder weapon. We're going to get to that a little bit later in this hour, but first, here's exactly what happened in the courtroom as we saw it play out. In a Moscow, Idaho courtroom, shackled at the feet, quadruple murder suspect Brian Koberger sat forward and alert.
Do you understand the maximum penalty?
He told the judge he understood the charges against him and answered questions clearly and concisely.
Yes, yes, yes.
All except one.
Is Mr. Koberger prepared to plead to these charges?
Your Honor, we will be standing silent.
Instead, under Idaho law, the judge entered pleas of not guilty for Koberger and set the trial for October. Outside the courthouse, family members of the victims staying silent. Meanwhile, new questions are coming to light after exclusive reporting from Dateline about the knife sheath found next to one of the victims. Investigators say they found Koberger's DNA evidence on that sheath. And now a source with inside knowledge of the investigation telling Dateline prosecutors may have other evidence linking Koberger to the weapon, including a purchase made 7 months before the murders.
Our source tells us police have found that Brian Koberger went online and visited Amazon.com to buy a couple of items. A knife, a K-bar, advertised as the best fixed blade knife in the world for hunting, sporting, military, and a knife sheath.
So far, investigators have turned over 10,000 pages of evidence and more than 50 terabytes of information to the defense as they prepare for trial. And NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos joins me now. Danny, starting with the question that so many people here in Moscow seem to be asking today, why would someone choose to stay silent knowing that the default would be not guilty anyway?
It's probably a control thing. I mean, everything we've seen about Koberger seems to suggest that he's kind of a smarter than everybody else character. Maybe that's not true. Maybe we just don't know enough about him, but that may be his way of controlling, or it may just be his way of not giving us, members of the media, any more of his voice than he wants to give us. Again, it all comes back to control. Procedurally, it doesn't mean much because this actually happens more than you might expect in court. Not necessarily a deliberate defiance way, but for many different reasons. Silence is usually a default not guilty plea, so procedurally, not a big deal.
Danny, interesting you say that about the control thing, because the thing is, he didn't choose to stay silent the whole time. When we were in court, we heard him answering questions. He was very direct. He was very measured with his speech when he was asked if he understood all those charges. Here's what a little bit of it sounded like. Take a listen.
Do you understand the charge in count 1, burglary?
Yes.
Do you understand the maximum penalty?
Yes.
Do you understand the charge in count 2, murder in the first degree?
Yes.
Do you understand the maximum penalty?
Yes.
Now, he never looked back at everybody else in the courtroom. He kept his eyes front and then towards his lawyer. But as you were looking at that, I mean, it's hard to know what somebody's thinking. But do you think that this could be a play at trying to appear cooperative or uncooperative? Is there any strategy behind that?
Yeah, I mean, it reads as an act of defiance. I mean, I would hardly call the one-word answers chatty. I mean, he's answering the questions he thinks he needs to procedurally. It may have been the case, and this happens a lot in court because you never really know how much a judge is going to colloquy your client, and that means ask those kinds of questions. The procedure varies wildly, not just from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but judge to judge. So I always tell a client going in, look, you may be made to answer a bunch of questions. I mean, nothing substantive, but an arraignment, you might get a question or two from the judge to put it on the record that you understand what's going on. So you see Kohberger saying no, no, or yes, yes, yes. But then when it comes to the how do you plead, that's the kind of thing he may have rehearsed in his mind and had an answer ready for, knowing that procedurally the effect is the same as pleading not guilty. Maybe that's his way of symbolically saying, I don't respect these charges or the authority of this court, without being overtly disrespectful. Instead, it's a small act of defiance. And look, when you're incarcerated, believe it or not, acts of defiance that may seem like no big deal to us take on a lot of meaning when you're just staring at the same four walls all day, every day, with nothing else to do.
And Gadi, what happens next here? He's been arraigned. We know that clock starts ticking on the 60-day decision on whether they're going to pursue the death penalty in this case. What is the prosecution doing during that 60 days, and what's the defense preparing as well?
What happens next is actually the more exciting thing, in my opinion, that happened today, which was that the defendant did not waive his speedy trial rights. In other words, that means that in Idaho, the state has 6 months in which to bring this case. Normally, if it's like a federal case and you've been investigated for years, then you know the government already has their case built. So there's no harm in waiving your speedy trial and getting more time to prepare your case. But in a case like this, where the reports indicate that the state isn't completely ready yet, they haven't completely finished building their case. After all, murder is a reactive crime. It's not something you investigate in advance. It's something that happens, and then the police have to build their case after the fact. So Kohberger and his defense team know that the state here is still building their case. And so by holding them to that 6-month timeline, they're increasing the odds that the state simply may not be ready. Now, does that mean they'll answer the call 6 months from now and say, we're just not ready, case dismissed? Probably not. But they won't necessarily be going into trial with the case that they wanted if the state had another, say, 6 months to prepare. So that is a very, very interesting and important decision a defendant makes, whether or not to waive speedy trial rights. And Kohberger in this case is saying, put up or shut up to the state.
And speaking a little bit about that death penalty, we've been hearing from family members of the victims that they want to pursue the death penalty, at least some of them. Is there any chance that the death penalty is taken off the table here?
Possibly as an offer to a plea, but I don't see any world in which Kohberger accepts a plea. Maybe, look, when you're sitting in prison or in jail awaiting trial, it wears a defendant down. And a lot of times that has a lot of effect on whether or not a defendant pleads guilty to a crime, even when the defendant insists that, hey, maybe, we could win this. But in this situation, almost all death penalty decisions are, in a sense, difficult ones for the prosecution because, number one, the death penalty is so rarely actually carried out in this country, whether at the federal level or the state level. Some states, obviously Texas, executes people a lot faster than other states and with a lot more, I guess, efficiency or frequency. But the choice to bring the death penalty is often a really difficult one for the prosecution because they know that it's a good chance the death penalty may never be carried out. And also it may mire them in appeals for years. But maybe we'll see them bring it as a bargaining chip to possibly put the pressure on Kohberger.
Danny Cevallos, thanks so very much for joining us on a case that we're going to continue to follow extremely closely. Now let's turn to our other big story tonight, and that is the debt ceiling. Just moments ago, President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy were inside the Oval Office hashing it out. That meeting lasting for about an hour and a half and once again ended without a deal. Here's what the speaker said about it.
I felt we had a productive discussion. We don't have an agreement yet, but I did feel the discussion was productive in areas that we have differences of opinion. I think the tone tonight was better than any other time we've had discussions.
Now, keep in mind, time is running out. This weekend, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen reiterated that June 1st is a hard deadline. That leaves only about 10 days to get something done. But earlier today, Speaker McCarthy actually said we need a deal by the end of the week, raising the stakes even higher. And joining us now is NBC's Garrett Hake. Garrett, what's the latest?
Well, Gadi, the operative word of the night appears to be productive. You heard it there from Speaker McCarthy twice in that one soundbite. Just a few minutes ago, we got a statement from President Biden also describing today's meetings as productive. What seems to be happening in these meetings as they've progressed over the last 3 weeks are the group of people in the discussions is getting smaller, and the items that they are discussing on the proverbial table here are getting shorter. That list is getting shorter. The parties are narrowing the scopes of their discussions, but you heard McCarthy say it. No deal tonight. Staff are apparently going to be working through the night. We just watched a pretty large pizza delivery go into the speaker's office. Never a good sign, going back to the college days, that how you're going to be working over the night. But look, the time is of the essence here. Both groups recognize that. It's just a question of whether they can close the differences between them and come to an actual agreement.
Other than pizza, what is on the table in there? What are the biggest hitches that seem to be holding all this up?
Well, the problem here, Gadi, is it's almost all hitches at this point. I mean, the groups have failed to agree on the really basic thing here, which is Republicans want to see a direct spending cut going forward. That's the single biggest thing they're asking for. They want to spend less money next year than we spent this year or the year before. And Democrats have said that's not acceptable to them. Democrats have floated the idea of freezing spending, saying, all right, how about next year we spend exactly the same amount? And with inflation, that sort of counts as a cut. McCarthy dismissed that out of hand today. And if you don't come to that kind of first agreement of what are we going to spend money on next year, it's hard to solve all those other issues kind of further down the decision tree, if you will. So while staff are going to be meeting all night long tonight, I'm not exactly sure what they're going to be able to come to agreement on until they somebody blinks in this staring contest on just the amounts that we're going to be talking about here.
And Garrett, there's been so much talk about invoking the 14th Amendment here, even from President Biden himself. Remind us, what is it and how does it apply here?
Right. I mean, this has never been tried before, but the idea of the 14th Amendment, which was put in place after the Civil War, is to guarantee America's debts. And by the way, to make sure that the Confederacies wouldn't be paid. I mean, that's the age of a law that we're talking about here. But the theory is that by invoking the 14th Amendment, it's kind of like the Michael Scott in The Office joke of I declare bankruptcy. The president could invoke the 14th Amendment and say, we're going to pay these bills kind of regardless of what anybody else thinks. Now, the problem with that is it's never been tried before, and the expectation is the White House would get sued and it might throw the whole thing into chaos. And oh, by the way, the markets might freak out because they might not think it's a good enough solution either. So it works in theory, a good thing for the president to have in his back pocket, at least as a negotiating tool. But I don't know that there's really serious discussions about using it for those reasons.
I don't know. Michael Scott for president sounds pretty great right now. Garrett Hake.
Sometimes that's what it feels like around here.
Yeah. And Republican Senator Tim Scott has officially jumped into the presidential race with a speech where he tried to be optimistic while also attacking the president.
Every single one of us are here because of the American journey, where there were obstacles that became opportunities. But unfortunately, under President Biden, our nation is retreating away from patriotism and faith.
Now, Scott is the first black senator from South Carolina and says he is the first in his family to attend college. He seems to be banking on his personal story to help carry him to the Republican nomination. That and the $22 million he's going to transfer from his Senate campaign to kick off today's presidential bid. But is that going to be enough to convince Republicans to pick Scott over frontrunner Donald Trump and some other very big name candidates that are going to be on the Republican ticket? NBC's Tom Yamas joins us now from North Charleston, South Carolina, with some more. Tom, thanks so much for joining us. Tim Scott, he kind of seems like an afterthought in polling right now. So what's the path to success today?
Yeah, so Senator Tim Scott is having some trouble polling. I will, remind you, Gadi, I know you know this, the race is still very, very early. I had a chance to sit down with the senator after his speech. It was an exclusive interview to sort of understand what your question was, right? How does he pull away? How does he win this race, right? He believes there's a path for him. He believes that in the Republican Party, there's a path for somebody with an optimistic message, right? And the phrase he's using now is the power of persuasion. That's how he hopes to separate himself from former President Trump. Now, I'll remind you that former President Trump actually sent out a tweet welcoming him to the race and telling him good luck. This is very strange. Clearly, Trump does not feel threatened in any way by Senator Tim Scott, because all Trump's been doing is attacking Governor Ron DeSantis, who's polling second. But since Senator Scott is in the single digits, I'm sure he doesn't see him as a threat. That being said, Scott still feels that there's a lane for him, that Republicans want to turn the page from Trump. They want optimism. They want someone who has a hopeful message. People call them like a happy warrior, if you will. The problem is that we haven't seen someone win like that on the national stage in a long time, right? Somebody to win like that in the Republican primary, it's going to be hard, because you have DeSantis, who's launching a very aggressive campaign. You have former President Trump, who's always sort of in that aggressive mode. And then you have this string of other candidates, which Senator Tim Scott is a part of, who may gobble up some votes, but in the end, some people will say they only make former President Trump even stronger when it's going to come down to voting.
Talking a little bit about the messaging that you were just mentioning, let's take a listen to what that sounds like. I think we've got some sound from Tim Scott and some of what he told you earlier today.
You have a very positive message, a hopeful message. You quote scripture, and yet the two people leading the GOP field right now, former President Trump and Governor DeSantis, they're not afraid to demonize their opponents. So my question to you is, do you think GOP voters want someone carrying a Bible, or do they want someone driving a bulldozer into the Democrats?
Well, it depends on whether you're willing to hit somebody with that Bible if necessary. That's kind of the question, right? One thing that you'll learn about the gospel is that in both Old Testament and New Testament, Jesus took a whip out and tore up the synagogue because he had no choice. So the truth is that what people really want is an optimistic, positive, conservative who has a backbone, but also believes that the best is yet to come.
An optimistic, positive, peaceful, but also warrior and fighter. Do you think that all of that is going to resonate with the Republican base heading into 2024?
Look, Senator Scott hopes it does. He's in Iowa. He's going to head to Iowa and New Hampshire. He's going to be up with ads. He's raised a lot of money. He has a lot of money to sort of stay in this race. But one of the qualifications to get up on the debate stage, at least the Fox debate coming up in August, we believe it's going to be you have to have 40,000 unique donors, and you also have to hit a certain polling percentage. Senator Scott does have some trouble when it comes to polling, but he hopes to work on that. That's why he's doing things like interviews. That's why he's going to be out on the campaign trail. It's why he's launched his campaign now. The issue is that he's going to run into is that right now Governor DeSantis likely will launch his campaign this week. And after that, we're expecting possibly former Vice President Mike Pence, former Governor Chris Christie, even the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, to enter the ring as well. So there's going to be a lot of people gobbling up a lot of that news coverage. And he's going to have to stand out. But you never know. Look, I will say this. People who win the Iowa caucuses, at least recently, have always been the most Christian-centric candidate when it comes to the GOP. And right now, at least in the race, Senator Tim Scott is quoting scripture wherever he's at, reminding voters that God and his faith are very close to him. Gadi?
Tom Yamas with a fascinating interview. Thanks so much, Tom. And still ahead this hour, the Marine veteran arrested for the death of a man on a New York subway breaks his silence. Daniel Penny has been charged with manslaughter after putting Jordan Neely in a chokehold, but he is now speaking out saying he is not a white supremacist. More on that story when we come back. Stay tuned. Hey there, thanks for sticking with us. Here's some of the other headlines we're watching tonight. Nebraska Republican Governor Jim Pillen signed a law today that bans abortions at the 12-week mark, as well as restricts medical care for transgender people younger than 19. Now, the abortion ban includes exemptions for rape, incest, and to save the life of a mother. The limits on gender-affirming care also restricts the use of hormone treatments and puberty blockers in minors. And it's the first doctor's strike at a hospital in New York City in some 3 decades. It is 120 150 trainee doctors went on strike at a public hospital in Queens. The striking doctors allege they are paid less working at a public hospital, which typically cares for poorer patients, than their counterparts in wealthier areas. And about 60,000 pounds of the chemical that's used as a fertilizer and also in explosives is still missing. Now, the ammonium nitrate was lost on a train shipment from Wyoming to California last month. The company that makes the chemical says it does not suspect any criminal or malicious activity involved. And remember Paul Whelan? He's an American wrongfully detained in Russia. Well, yesterday he told CNN that he is confident, quote, the wheels are turning toward his release. Whelan was arrested in 2018 on espionage charges and is serving a 16-year prison sentence. And today, TikTok sued Montana just days after the state said it would ban the app starting next year. TikTok alleging that the ban is unconstitutional, arguing that the legislation violated the First Amendment as well as parts of the Constitution that limits state powers. And Daniel Penny, the Marine vet accused of killing a black man on the New York City subway, is finally speaking out. He says he is, quote, not a white supremacist and the incident has nothing to do with race. The 24-year-old was caught on video putting Jordan Neely in a deadly chokehold. Now, Penny is facing a second-degree manslaughter charge over Neely's death. And NBC's Emily Akeda has more.
Nearly 3 weeks since this subway encounter, the man seen holding Jordan Neely in the deadly chokehold is breaking his silence, suggesting he would take action again under similar circumstances. I would, if there was a threat and danger in the present, Daniel Penny told the New York Post. In the interview near his hometown on Long Island, the 24-year-old Marine veteran and college student said this had nothing to do with race, adding, I judge a person based on their character. I'm not a white supremacist. Penny, who was accused of second-degree manslaughter, wouldn't go into detail about what led up to the confrontation, but indicated it wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. His lawyers say Penny acted in self-defense after Neely, who was homeless and long suffered from mental illness, aggressively threatened him and others on board. Penny wasn't initially arrested, quickly spawning protests that spilled onto subway tracks and dividing political leaders nationwide over crime, so-called vigilantism, and the response to record levels of homelessness. On Friday, hundreds gathered to remember the 30-year-old street performer.
Justice for! Fighting for!
We keep criminalizing people with mental illness. They don't need abuse, they need help.
When asked what Penny would say to Neely's family, he said, I'm deeply saddened by the loss of life. It's tragic what happened to him. Hopefully we can change the system that so desperately failed us. Penny faces up to 15 years in jail if convicted of manslaughter, a charge lawyers for Neely's family say doesn't go far enough.
Emily Akeda, thanks so much. And coming up next, last fall, Hurricane Ian devastated parts of Florida. And now, months later, insurance battles are an absolute nightmare for a lot of homeowners out there. But first, you got to see this. This has not been done since 1996. This week, Michael Block made history as the first PGA Club pro to make a hole-in-one at the PGA Championship. Now, the last person to do it was George Bowman almost 30 years ago. He needed a top 15 finish to secure a ticket to the major next year, but Block, he slammed his tee, slam dunked it right into the cup without even rattling the flagstick. Block's reaction was total disbelief, even asking his group if it really went in. And that spectacular shot is, you gotta say, a perfect storybook ending to a PGA Championship fairy tale. We'll be right back. Hey, welcome back. Let's get you caught up real quick in 30 seconds. Idaho murder suspect Bryan Kohberger declined to enter a plea to his charges today, and that led the judge to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy met in the White House earlier tonight. They are trying to hammer out a deal that would prevent a default on the country's debt. And Republican Senator Tim Scott has officially thrown his hat in the ring for president. Scott seems to be betting on a message of hope and optimism as a path to the nomination. And welcome back to Moscow, Idaho. Today, the man accused of stabbing and killing 4 University of Idaho students was in court for the first time since a grand jury indicted him. Now, Bryan Kohberger remained silent when he was asked how he would plea. The judge had to enter a not guilty plea for the 4 murder charges he is facing. And this comes as NBC's Dateline exclusively reports that a source with inside knowledge of the investigation says detectives found evidence Kohberger went on Amazon to buy a K-bar knife and sheath before he graduated from another college 7 months before those murders.
Before he received his master's degree from DeSales, a month before, our source tells us, police have found that Bryan Kohberger went online and visited Amazon.com to buy a couple of items. A knife, a K-bar, advertised as the best fixed-blade knife in the world for hunting, sporting, military, and a knife sheath.
Longtime FBI profiler Greg Cooper has a theory.
What did that say to you about the kind of thinking that had gone into this?
Fantasy. He's been thinking about committing crimes for a long time.
With that knife?
Absolutely. He has to become familiar with it, feel at ease with it.
And something else we learned about Dateline's reporting is this interaction that Kohberger had with a classmate prior to the murders. Take a look.
Dateline has learned new details of another incident that are disturbing. Our source says Kohberger had befriended a woman in his graduate criminology cohort. The woman had returned to her apartment one evening and found some things amiss. Items moved from where she'd left them. In the kitchen, in the bath. Quite bizarre.
So what did she do? Well, our source tells us that since nothing had been taken, the woman did not call the police. Instead, she called her new friend, Bryan Kohberger, who, our source says, volunteered to come over and take a look, and he soon recommended the installation of a video security system, and he, Kohberger, volunteered to do the work. After the installation, our source says, police believe Kohberger, if he was close enough to the woman's apartment, could pull up the cameras himself for a look, because Kohberger knew the woman's Wi-Fi password.
Our source tells us that Bryan Kohberger is now considered a strong suspect in the break-in.
Bizarre, right? Well, back here at the courthouse, prosecutors will now have 60 days to decide whether they're going to pursue the death penalty in this case. And while there is still a gag order that's been issued preventing a lot of the victims' families from talking about many of the details in this case, family members did tell us they do not want people to lose sight of the lives that were lost, like victim Maddie Mogan, whose 22nd birthday would have been this week. Meanwhile, in other news, Hurricane Ian was the deadliest hurricane to hit Florida in almost a century, and a lot of homeowners were left reeling with all kinds of property damage as well. According to some Floridians, dealing with the insurance companies has been a nightmare. NBC's Lester Holt has more.
This was our master bedroom.
What was once the Clifford family's home is now an unlivable maze of studs.
This home is uninhabitable right now.
Absolutely.
For how long?
Until we can fix it.
When Ian tore through Florida last September, they had just relocated from New Jersey and were days away from moving into their new home. They say the roof was damaged, the floors and ceilings soaked. But the Cliffords thought they were relatively lucky. Then they say 9-year-old Sheila started getting sick.
When was the moment you realized you couldn't live here anymore?
The moment they told me that there was mold in my daughter's rooms and it wasn't safe for them to stay there anymore.
An adjuster the Cliffords hired estimates there's more than $400,000 worth of damage. They didn't have flood insurance, and their homeowner's insurance has only covered the damage to the roof.
They sent a check for, I think, after a deductible, about $4,800.
Is $4,800 going to cut it?
No.
Close?
Not at all.
The company sent a letter saying the damage is not covered because it could have occurred from wind-driven rain or elevated flood levels. The Cliffords are now suing the insurance company, which told NBC News they were unable to comment further due to the ongoing litigation.
How would you rank the insurance response to this storm?
Absolutely garbage.
terrible.
8 months after Hurricane Ian, destruction is still a common sight here. Many homeowners blame insurance companies, saying payouts have been slow and insufficient. And now Florida's Department of Financial Services is investigating possible fraud after several independent adjusters came forward alleging their work had been manipulated to pay policyholders less.
What made you want to come forward and discuss this?
The fact that it was just wrong as wrong can be. There's no doors or windows left.
When a catastrophic storm hits, adjusters like Mark Vinson and Jordan Lee are hired by companies called third-party administrators, or TPAs, to help insurance companies get through the mountains of claims. Their job is to go to homes and estimate property damage. The companies can make revisions to those reports, but the adjusters say major changes were made without their collaboration or consent.
44 of the 46 claims that I turned into the firm that I was working for, they manipulated 44 of them.
What kind of things were different than when you signed off?
There were missing pictures, and the dollar amount was significantly reduced from what I had originally written for.
Would you pick up the phone and challenge them?
I did. They gave me no basis as to why they were making those changes.
NBC News has reviewed several of the reports they submitted and the final copies. In many cases, the losses were reduced by tens of thousands of dollars.
I have one that I wrote for $239,000, and the altered estimate was $3,476. It's completely wrecked.
The final report still lists the adjusters' names.
Has your work been wholly misrepresented?
Very much so. You know, you come out to a Category 5 hurricane home, the roof, you see damage, and then I write an estimate for that damage. By the time it gets back to the policyholder, that roof is not on that estimate at all. I mean, what do you do?
The insurance company associated with Vinson's work says it takes these kinds of allegations very seriously, adding TPAs internally review and make correct adjustments before they are presented to companies for a coverage determination. The TPA and insurance company Lee worked for have not responded to NBC News' request for comment.
Have you seen these altered estimates in other disasters?
Yes, we have.
Doug Quinn founded the nonprofit American Policyholder Association after his home was destroyed in Superstorm Sandy.
These are people that did the right thing. They put a safety net in place in case something like this happens. And when that safety net fails them, what they go through is devastating.
As for the Cliffords, they say they have no idea when they'll be able to return home.
Are you in limbo?
Kind of just keep reiterating to myself that there's got to be light at the end of the tunnel.
Lester Holt, thanks so much. And coming up, police still don't have any suspects in custody after a deadly shooting in Baja California, Mexico. More on that story is straight ahead.
What happened here yesterday, it surprised us all. I thought this was a peaceful place, but now I realize it's not.
Hey, welcome back. Let's take you around the world real quick in 80 seconds. The European Union has slapped Meta with a hefty $1.3 billion fine, saying it broke privacy laws by transferring user data from Europe to the United States. Meta says it is going to appeal that decision, which could likely set up for a lengthy legal fight. And 3 Palestinians are dead after an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank today. This is according to Palestinian health officials there. The raid comes a day after the Biden administration condemned Israel for its latest act of settlement expansion. And firefighters in Alberta, Canada are hoping that heavy rains will help them make some real progress in battling a number of wildfires. Right now, authorities say there are more than 80 wildfires burning in western Alberta. And a volcano has erupted in Italy, forcing a nearby airport to temporarily stop flights. Now, Mount Etna started spitting ash yesterday morning, which covered the airport's runways and some neighboring cars. Mount Etna's last major eruption was in 1992. And tonight in Ukraine, the battle over the key city of Bakhmut is turning into a tale of 2 stories. Russia has declared victory, claiming they have full control over the city, but Ukraine sees things differently, saying their forces are still fighting on the outskirts of town. The debate comes on the heels of President Zelensky's visit to Japan, where he rallied support from G7 leaders and secured a crucial $375 million in U.S. military aid. NBC's Molly Hunter is in Kharkiv with more.
Yeah, that's right. And I got to say, it is so hard to figure out exactly what is happening. These battlefield lines, the front line, I should say, is shifting around Bakhmut. What happened over the weekend is that both the Wagner group, that is the mercenary group that has been fighting on the front lines, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, claimed total victory, total control of the city center of Bakhmut. On Sunday, Putin apparently, according to state TV, congratulated Russian troops. Even one of the anchors on Russian state TV, again, this is propaganda, Russian state TV, claimed mission accomplished. They showed video of soldiers waving Russian flags on the rubble of Bakhmut. That was over the weekend. And what's happening today is Ukrainian officials are acknowledging that they don't control anything significant. They don't have a significant foothold in that city, which has been really fierce urban combat, lots of high-rise buildings when you look at those pictures. But what they're saying is they're fighting along the flanks, and this is now a battle for the outskirts. You got to say, Bakhmut itself, it was home to 80,000 people before the war. It is obliterated now. When you see pictures, it is uninhabitable. No one lives there. And actually, we heard President Zelensky speaking over the weekend, and he said nothing is there. They have destroyed it all except for Russian dead bodies. But what's happened is because it has been such a long battle, it is now incredibly strategic for Russia. On the Ukrainian side, they have long said that really what their troops are doing there are keeping Russian forces occupied. They are keeping a huge amount of resources in a protracted battle, and that allows the Ukrainian the Ukrainian military to rearm and reorganize elsewhere. Of course, we have heard about that counteroffensive. We do not know when exactly that will start, but we do expect President Zelensky to return from Japan. Of course, he comes back triumphantly with that huge military package, $375 million in new U.S. military aid, and of course, that agreement to start forming an international coalition around F-16 fighter jets. I'll send it back to you.
Molly Hunter, thanks so much. Please stay safe out there. The suspects are still on the loose after a deadly shooting in Baja California, Mexico, that left at least 10 people dead. Now, it all went down at an off-road car rally, and NBC's Valerie Castro has that story.
The search is on for a group of gunmen suspected of killing at least 10 people in Baja California Saturday afternoon. The sound of continuous gunfire filling the air at what was supposed to be a peaceful car event in the Mexican city of Ensenada.
What happened here yesterday, it surprised us all. I thought this was a peaceful place, but now I realize it's not.
According to Mexican State Police, a group of men with guns hopped out of a gray van on Saturday afternoon and opened fire at the people at the car show. The suspects fled the scene, and now the mayor of the Mexican city, Ensenada, has commissioned a special task force to investigate the massacre. The citizens of Ensenada left petrified.
This shooting really impacted us. When I heard the gunfire, I felt paralyzed.
The city of Ensenada has recorded 26 cases of homicide through April this year, far fewer than the nearby city of Tijuana, which has 598 homicides, according to the Mexican government. The U.S. State Department urging Americans to reconsider travel to Baja California due to crime and kidnapping, and warning of violence between rival cartel factions. The roadshow's organizer apologizing with condolences to the families of the victims and writing on their Instagram, quote, "We're as baffled as all of you, and we have nothing to do with what happened."
Valerie Castro, thanks so much. Before we go, it is time for the future of everything. And tonight, it is all things space travel. The International Space Station has some new roommates tonight. We're going to take a look at the Axiom mission. Plus, NASA appears to be one step closer to putting humans on Mars, but is it worth it? Spoiler alert, yes, it is. Check this out.
I'm all for people in space. But to accomplish scientific goals, the robot can live off of sunlight and you can't. The robot is not going to cry because we ran out of money and we can't bring you back.
And another milestone moment in the future of commercial spaceflight. Today, SpaceX successfully delivered a crew of 4 to the International Space Station.
3, 2, 1. Engines full power. And liftoff, Falcon 9.
And we have our first views of the Axiom crew members floating aboard. First is Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot John Schaffner making his first visit. The crew of the space station is now 11 crew members. Big smiles from Rayana Barnawi. She is now the first female Saudi to go to space.
Big smiles all around. The crew includes 2 Saudi astronauts, an entrepreneur, America's most experienced astronaut as well, who just happens to be in charge. We got a chance to visit with Commander Peggy Whitson when she was still here on Earth.
That's the purpose of these precursor missions to our Axiom station, is to get us trained up and ready to go. When we get the first module, it will be attached to the International Space Station, and in late 2025.
And NBC's Marissa Parra joins us from Kennedy Space Center. Marissa, let's start with the launch. It seemed like everything went off as planned.
Well, listen, they made it to the space station and they made it there safely. But in terms of as planned, keep in mind that this launch was already a result of a delay. It was supposed to happen weeks ago. And then yesterday and today, they had a very narrow margin here. If they didn't make it by either yesterday or today to launch, they would have to wait much further down the line because there's an assembly line of other launches that are supposed to happen from here at the Kennedy Space Center. So yesterday, as they were just minutes away from launch, there were some clouds that were just miles away that really did threaten it. But thankfully, the weather gods were smiling upon those astronauts because they were able to make it there. And thank goodness, because you can see from behind me, the weather is not so great right now. But they're at the International Space Station as we speak, so all is well.
It sounds like you almost said that there was a potential rocket traffic jam. Like, is that where we are now, that humans are having to stagger rocket launches because we're sending so many up?
Honestly, yes. I mean, that's why they call it the space race. I mean, there is an assembly line of other things that are happening. I mean, not just crewed launches, but you also have cargo missions, things being sent to the International Space Station for those astronauts that are already there. And listen, even when we look at Axiom's plans, we're still in the process of talking about this launch yesterday, but there's another launch coming up at the end of this year. It's really only going to ramp up, Gadi, as the years go on.
There was also a pretty incredible milestone that we saw back here on Earth. The rocket's booster was able to land back on the launch pad. Let's take a quick look.
Our tracking cameras. We can see the grid fins actuating to help steer the booster down.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Stage 2 FTS has saved.
Standing by to...
Stage 1 landing leg deploy.
All right, so we have seen SpaceX stick the landing again and again and again, but explain the significance of that particular moment.
Yeah, so what you just watched was the very first time that SpaceX landed and returned a rocket booster to land after a crewed launch instead of in the ocean, which is what we have normally seen. And I don't want to make you jealous, Gadi, but it was actually even more impressive to see in person. It was just over in this direction. We watched it come down. It looked like a ball of fire. It actually generated a sonic boom that was so powerful. It set off all the cars and the car alarms around us. Almost exciting as the launch itself.
I am so jealous now. So I got to ask, when are they supposed to leave ISS? When do they have to leave the International Space Station? And what does a return trip look like?
Yeah, great question. So they're doing experiments. I mean, obviously they're enjoying zero gravity for the 3 astronauts who have never been up to space before. But besides that, they're doing some important work. They're doing outreach to inspire the next generation of astronauts, but also experiments, including looking at whether stem cells are impacted by zero gravity conditions. So they have 8 days to conduct all of these experiments before they make their great return back here to Earth. And they're going to have a splashdown in either the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Ocean. But like anything, just like launch, it's all going to depend on the weather. Hopefully better than what we're seeing right now, Gadi.
Marissa Parra with the coolest assignment in the universe. Thanks so much. So the Axiom mission is focused on getting people to the International Space Station. At the same time, there's a race to get back to the moon and hopefully even Mars. And now, more than 50 years after the first moon landing, today's space race includes a billionaire and another country with designs on the moon and beyond, China. Here's NBC's Tom Costello.
1 month after Elon Musk's Starship launched, then broke apart on liftoff.
A rapid unscheduled disassembly.
Both SpaceX and NASA insist they're committed to the rocket. First to land astronauts on the moon, but ultimately to carry crews to Mars as soon as 2040. While science and exploration are the driving motivators, there's also a competitive factor: China.
The Chinese government is very secretive, and a lot of their plans involve their military preparations. And so there's a reason for us to get there first.
And NASA wants to get there faster. A round-trip mission to Mars could take 2 to 3 years. So to cut the travel time, America is going back to the future.
This project was called NERVA.
To the 1960s, and a government program most Americans have never heard of, to develop nuclear-powered rockets.
Someday, a manned trip to Mars and return may become the mission assignment.
It turns out they made big progress back in the 60s, running expensive tests. The goal now, send astronauts to the moon and beyond on nuclear rockets. When the Apollo astronauts went to the moon, they needed 5 of these massive F-1 engines just to get them off the Earth and escape the Earth's gravitational pull. 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Here at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, they've got an exact replica to scale of the Saturn V, 363 feet tall. Future astronauts will need that kind of lift, but once they're in space, they can use a much smaller engine, a nuclear engine, to go all the way to Mars and back, a fraction of the size. And that engine could last 20 years. This is a big place. It's happening now at the Marshall Test Flight Center in Huntsville.
This is where they put components of nuclear thermal rockets, such as this fuel element here, and like the one that you're holding.
These are the building blocks for America's future nuclear propulsion going to space.
Yes.
But America's best-known astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson, wonders why we're going.
So I'm all for people in space, but to accomplish scientific goals, the robot can live off of sunlight and you can't. The robot is not going to cry because we ran out of money, we can't bring you back.
Tom Costello, thanks so much. Hard to argue with Neil deGrasse Tyson, but we may have some differences there. Now over to Arizona, where 3 women are spreading surprises throughout Tucson to share their love of reading. Today's Jenna Bush Hager has a story.
So we'll start on the east side?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Meet Emily, Jody, and Mary Ellen, the 3 women behind the Tucson Home Gnome.
We wanted to share books in order to help spread literacy and kindness.
An idea that came to Emily during the pandemic.
I felt like so disconnected from everyone in my life. Books were kind of what helped keep me sane. So I was like, what if we just shared books with people? What if we just did a random act of kindness? People could find a book out in their community and maybe realize they're not alone.
But like every good book, they needed a great name.
There's not a lot of great, like, bookish things that rhyme with book. So I was like, tome. And my husband's like, gnome. And I was like, I'm here for this. It's the Tome Gnome. It's the Tucson Tome Gnome.
Every month, the trio chooses a different book to hide.
We want it to be very inclusive, and we also want to amplify marginalized voices. And so we tend to find books that may not be on everyone's radar, but that we love.
To date, we have hidden 730 books. 30 are done scavenger hunt style. We pick a Sunday every month, go hide the book. The other 15, we split between the 3 of us and actually hide in essentially parts of town that we call book deserts, where there may not be easy access to a library.
It takes them about 7 to 8 hours to hide the books.
We sneak out. Well, we don't really sneak out, but we kind of try to look inconspicuous. And we set the book down, and then we post hints throughout the day on Instagram.
Once they post it, I just start driving that way and hope that it's still there when I get there. A couple months ago, I drove all over town. I went to like 8 different spots. I like the community feel of it.
Jessica Hill brings her daughter, Abby.
I love to go and look for them with my family.
It makes me feel like a kid again, right? Going on a hunt and getting to find something that someone else has so lovingly put out there.
And the adventure has captured many new readers, like Cynthia Bardo.
I never used to read, and I think the fun of finding the book helped me stay in the book.
You know, there's a lot in this country that we focus on children's literacy and joy, like book joy for older teens and grown-ups kind of just like drops away. And so I think that's something that the three of us really thought was valuable. Like, this is a huge gap, like book joy for adults.
Emily's small idea impacting the Tucson community, one page at a time.
It is truly just meant to be this kindness project and seeing people enjoy finding a book.
Jenna Bush Hager, NBC News.
Book joy for adults. Jenna Bush Hager, thanks so much. That does it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you tomorrow, but until then, stay tuned now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.